It was a quiet evening as John walked home through the quiet alley near his apartment. He had just finished a long day at work and was eager to get home. The moon was barely visible behind the thick clouds, and the streetlights flickered softly, casting shadows across the pavement. It was the kind of night when everything felt still, almost too still. As he walked, he heard a faint sound, something like a cry, barely audible over the wind. John paused and listened carefully. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the cry came again, a little louder this time. Curiosity pulled him forward, and he followed the sound until he reached the corner of the alley. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Lying on the ground, partially hidden by a pile of discarded boxes, was a figure. At first, John thought it might be a person in trouble, but as he got closer, he realized that the figure was far from human. Her skin shimmered in the dim light, not like anything he had ever seen. It wasn't the pale glow of some sickly person. It was an otherworldly, faint silver sheen that seemed to ripple as she breathed. John's heart raced as he approached her carefully, wondering if he was imagining it. Was she an alien? He had heard the rumors, of course, stories about sightings and strange encounters. But he never thought he would be the one to experience it firsthand. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing large dark irises that seemed to absorb the light around her. She gasped for air, her chest rising and falling rapidly. John knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked cautiously, his voice shaking slightly. The woman's eyes focused on him, and for a moment, they just stared at each other in silence. There was something almost hypnotic about the way she looked at him, as if she could see straight through him, past his thoughts and into his very soul. Then, in a voice that sounded strangely melodic, she whispered, "Help me." John hesitated. What should he do? This wasn't something he was prepared for. But there was something about her, something that made him want to help her, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Without thinking much further, he gently lifted her into his arms, trying to support her fragile form. "Hold on," he said, though he had no idea how he would help her. His mind was racing with questions. Who was she? What was she? And how did she end up here? As he carried her out of the alley, he noticed a strange, soft hum emanating from her body. It wasn't like any sound he had ever heard. It was quiet but steady, almost like a heartbeat that wasn't quite his own. John looked around, feeling a strange weight in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was going on, something he hadn't even begun to understand. All he knew was that this mysterious woman, this alien princess, had somehow crossed into his life, and he couldn't turn his back on her now. The quiet moment in the park didn't last long. As John sat beside Cirrus, the reality of their situation sank in. He had just agreed to something bigger than he could fully comprehend. A marriage, a promise to protect an alien princess, and the chance to stop a war. Everything seemed to be moving so fast. But the look in Cirrus's eyes, the trust she had placed in him, kept him from turning back. Cirrus stood up from the bench, her eyes scanning the surroundings nervously. "We don't have much time," she said quietly, her voice tense. "We need to move before they find us." John stood too, the weight of the situation pressing on him. "Where do we go now?" he asked, unsure of where to begin. Cirrus paused, her face hardening as if she was trying to decide something. She seemed to be looking ahead, planning their next step. "There's a safe house," she said after a moment. "It's not far from here. We'll be safe there, for a while at least." John didn't hesitate. He knew there was no turning back now. He had already made his choice. He wasn't going to let Cirrus face whatever was coming alone. The soldiers would keep coming after her, but together, maybe they had a chance to stay ahead of them. As they walked toward the safe house, the streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the ground. The quiet seemed almost unnatural, as though the whole city was holding its breath. John kept his eyes on Cirrus, wondering what she was thinking. She had been so calm, so determined, but now he could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was carrying the weight of her people's fate, and John could only guess how heavy that burden must be. Finally, they arrived at a small, unmarked building tucked away on a quiet street. It didn't look like much, just another rundown structure among many in the city. But to Saris, it was a lifeline. She unlocked the door quickly, pulling John inside. The moment the door closed behind them, Saris turned to him. Her expression softened, and for the first time, she didn't look like the princess or the fugitive. She looked like a woman in need of comfort, someone who was just as scared as he was. "John," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need you to understand something." John looked at her, confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer to him, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. "This marriage, this alliance, it isn't just to protect me. It's not just a political move. I've been forced into so many things in my life, things I didn't want. But when I met you, I saw someone who wasn't afraid to stand up, to fight. I need you because you're the only person who's shown me that I can still have a choice." John's heart ached as he listened. He had never expected any of this, never imagined he would be involved in something so dangerous. But as he looked at Saris, he saw her not as a princess or a stranger from another world, but as someone he wanted to protect, someone who trusted him. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, "but I want you to know that it's not just about survival. I'm choosing you, John. I'm choosing you because you're the only one who hasn't made me feel like a prisoner." John didn't know what to say. He had agreed to the marriage out of necessity, but hearing her words changed everything. This wasn't just a political alliance, it was real. She was choosing him too. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm not going to let you down," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get through this together." Saris gave him a small, genuine smile, her relief obvious. But even as the tension seemed to ease, John couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The tension in the room didn't fade. The soldiers, though momentarily quiet, stood ready to act at any moment. John could feel their eyes on him, and the weight of the decision he had made weighed heavily on his shoulders. They were supposed to leave, but now, more than ever, John was beginning to feel like he had stepped into a story he wasn't prepared for. Saris didn't look back at the soldiers as she moved toward the door. Instead, she glanced at John, her gaze steady. He could see the anxiety behind her calm demeanor, but there was something else too, something fierce. She wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. "Let's go," Saris said quietly, her voice surprisingly calm. She stepped forward, leading the way as John followed closely behind. They made their way down the dark hallways of John's apartment building, walking quickly but not in a rush. The quiet seemed almost eerie now. John's thoughts raced with questions. Who was Saris really? Why were these soldiers so determined to bring her back? And most importantly, why was her life so important that it involved him in this strange conflict? As they reached the exit, Saris stopped and turned to John. Her face was soft now, though there was still a hint of tension in her eyes. "We need to talk," she said quietly. John's heart skipped a beat. "What about?" he asked. Saris hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the soldiers who were still a few steps behind them. "Not here," she said quickly. "I'll explain everything, but we have to go somewhere safe." John nodded, his curiosity piqued. He wanted to know why she had chosen him. Why, of all people, had she turned to him for help? And what was her real reason for wanting him to marry her? They found a quiet spot outside, a park a few blocks from the building. The area was deserted, a perfect place to talk without fear of being overheard. Saris leaned against a bench, her posture still guarded, though she looked more relaxed here, away from the soldiers. John took a seat next to her, his mind racing with thoughts. "All right, Saris," he said, his voice firm. "What's going on? Why is this so important? Why me?" Saris looked at him for a long moment, her eyes heavy with the weight of a secret. "I never wanted to involve you in this," she began, her voice quiet. But I didn't have a choice. You saved my life. And that changed everything. John blinked. How did that change everything? Ceres took a deep breath, her eyes distant. I wasn't just a princess when you found me. I'm also the heir to an empire that's at war. My people, they arranged my marriage to a man I don't love, someone who wants to control me. I fled, but it's not just the soldiers who are after me. It's the whole kingdom. John's heart raced as he listened. He hadn't expected this. He had thought she was just another person in need of help, but she was more than that. She was caught in a war, with an empire hunting her down. You're the only one I can trust now, she continued, her voice filled with emotion. I need you to help me stop them. Marrying you wasn't just about protection. It's because I can't do this alone. John sat there, stunned, trying to absorb the weight of her words. It was all so much to take in, but as he looked at her vulnerability, her strength, and the determination in her eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. He was already in this. I'll help you, John said, his voice steady now. I don't fully understand everything yet, but I'll help you. Ceres smiled, a hint of relief washing over her face. Thank you, she whispered. But even as they spoke, John knew that the real fight was just beginning. The air in the apartment was thick with tension. The alien soldiers stood in a line, unmoving, their dark helmets reflecting the faint light from the room. John felt the weight of their presence, like a storm about to break. Ceres was standing in front of him, her body rigid, her eyes locked on the soldiers. She didn't seem scared, not anymore. There was a cold defiance in her gaze, as though she had already made a decision. Princess, the soldier who had spoken earlier said, stepping forward. His voice was harsh, carrying an undeniable authority. It's time to come with us. Your people are waiting. This is your last chance. John glanced at Ceres, confusion and fear swirling inside him. What did they want with her? Why was she so important? He opened his mouth to ask, but Ceres held up a hand to stop him. They want to take me back, she said, her voice calm but filled with a deep, unshakable resolve. But I won't go back to them. The leader of the soldiers stepped closer, ignoring Ceres's defiance. You don't have a choice, he said, his tone almost bored. You are a princess. Your place is with your people. Ceres's eyes narrowed. Not anymore, she spat, her voice cold. She turned to John, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable, her face softening. I need your help, she said, her voice quieter now. I can't go back. But if I stay, they'll come for me. And for you. John was torn. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could see the desperation in Ceres's eyes. He had already risked everything to help her. And now, it seemed like it wasn't enough. These soldiers, these beings, weren't just here to take her back. They were here to make sure she never escaped again. You're going to have to come with us. The soldier growled, his voice low and threatening. But Ceres didn't flinch. She stood her ground, taking a step closer to John. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to gauge his next move. There is only one way to keep them away for good, she said, her voice steady despite the fear she was clearly holding back. You have to marry me. John blinked, not sure if he had heard her right. Marry you? He asked, his voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. What are you talking about? Ceres took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. It's the only way. If you marry me, they'll see it as an official alliance. They won't be able to touch me anymore. They'll have to accept our bond, or they'll face the consequences. John stood there, speechless, his mind racing. Marry her? He barely knew her. They had only met a few days ago, and now she was asking him to make a life-altering decision. Everything in him screamed that it was crazy, that it wasn't possible. But when he looked into Ceres's eyes, he saw the truth. She was scared, yes, but she was also determined. She wasn't asking him for a favor. She was asking him for survival. If I don't marry you, they'll kill you, John said quietly, the weight of the situation hitting him all at once. Cyrus nodded. Yes, it's the only way. John felt his chest tighten. The idea of marrying an alien princess was beyond anything he could have imagined. But the truth was, he couldn't let her go back to those soldiers. Not after everything they had been through. Not after seeing the fear in her eyes. All right, he said finally, his voice firm. I'll marry you. Cyrus's eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them stopped moving. She reached out and touched his hand gently. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know how much this means. But just as the tension seemed to break, the soldiers took a step forward, their cold eyes locked on Cyrus. Make no mistake, the leader said, his voice low. This is your last chance, princess. The sound of the soldiers' heavy boots echoed in the hallway, making John's heart race. He couldn't help but feel the pressure of the situation growing with every passing second. Cyrus was standing next to him, calm yet tense, her eyes scanning the room like she was already planning their next move. John, on the other hand, felt like he was barely keeping it together. Where are we going? John asked, his voice low as he kept his eyes on the soldiers. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cyrus turned to him, her face serious. We're going to the only place they won't look for us right now, but we have to move quickly. The soldiers were still standing in place, not moving but watching every move Cyrus made. They hadn't come to make a deal, John realized. They came to take her, no matter what. John couldn't stop the nerves from bubbling inside him. He was just a regular guy. How could he possibly be part of something this big? The weight of the alien princess's life in his hands was overwhelming. But seeing the fire in her eyes, seeing how much she believed in this, pushed him forward. The leader of the soldiers stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. Princess, we'll give you one last chance to come peacefully, he said, his voice cold and commanding. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. Cyrus looked at him, unbothered by his threat. I don't want to go with you, she said firmly, her voice strong. And I never will. John took a deep breath. It was clear Cyrus wasn't going to give in. She had made her choice, and she had decided to fight back. But the soldiers weren't going to just let her walk away. There had to be something they could do. We don't have much time, Cyrus whispered to John, turning to him. You need to act quickly. John nodded, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. He had to protect her, but how? What could he possibly do against soldiers from another galaxy who were clearly more powerful than him? He had no idea what kind of technology or weapons they had. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. Suddenly, Cyrus stepped forward, her posture straightening as if preparing for something. John followed her lead, though he wasn't sure what was coming next. I'll go with you, she said to the soldiers, her voice strong, surprising even John. But on one condition. The soldiers froze, unsure of what to expect next. Cyrus didn't wait for them to respond. If you leave him alone, if you don't hurt him, I will go with you. I will marry the human and protect him as my own. But I'll do this on my terms, not yours. John was stunned by her words. He had agreed to marry her out of necessity, but hearing her say it so openly felt like a huge leap. But in that moment, he realized that this was the only way forward. If they had to play along with this marriage, they would do it together. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to defeat whatever enemies were after them. The leader of the soldiers looked at Cyrus for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But you better keep your word, princess. If not, there will be consequences. Cyrus turned to John, her eyes softening just a bit. We'll do this, she said quietly, taking his hand. But we do it together. John squeezed her hand, a sense of determination growing inside him. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were in this together. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. John carried the strange woman through the streets, his mind racing. He had no idea what to do or where to take her. Every step felt heavy, and the eerie hum that seemed to surround her only added to the unsettling feeling in his gut. He had never believed in aliens, never thought such things could be real. Yet here he was, carrying one like it was the most normal thing in the world. He finally reached his apartment building. It wasn't much, a small old building in the middle of the city, nothing special. But it was home. John quickly rushed up the stairs, using his free hand to swipe his keycard and unlock his door. Once inside, he gently placed the woman on his couch, still unsure of what was happening. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her. Her breathing had slowed, and the soft glow around her seemed to flicker with every breath she took. She didn't look dangerous, but something in her eyes told him that she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "Are you all right?" John asked again, his voice quiet but firm. The woman's eyes opened slowly. She looked up at him, blinking a few times as if trying to adjust to the surroundings. When her gaze finally focused on him, her lips parted and she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, almost musical. "You saved me." John blinked, unsure of what to say. I just found you in the alley," he stammered. "What's going on? Who are you?" The woman took a slow breath, as if gathering strength. She sat up, her long, silver hair falling around her like a curtain. Her skin still shimmered faintly, and her eyes held a mix of confusion and something else, something deep. "I am called Cirrus," she said. "I am not from your world." She paused and then added with a slight tremor, "I was in danger." John watched her closely, still trying to make sense of everything. "From who?" he asked. Cirrus hesitated, her eyes darkening. "My people," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "They want me back, but not for a good reason." She looked up at him then, her eyes pleading. "I need your help." John's mind raced. His first instinct was to walk away, to tell her he couldn't get involved in something so dangerous. But he couldn't ignore the look in her eyes. There was a pain there, something raw and desperate. She wasn't asking for much. She was asking for help. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice steady now. He didn't know what he was agreeing to, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to turn his back on her. Cirrus smiled faintly, and for the first time, John saw something that resembled relief in her expression. "I need protection," she said. "If they find me, they'll take me. And worse," her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't want to go back to them." John didn't fully understand, but he could see the fear in her eyes. The woman who had come from another world, the one who had been in danger, was looking at him like he was her only hope. He nodded, though he still had no idea what he was getting himself into. "All right," he said. "I'll help you." Cirrus gave him a look of gratitude so deep it almost took his breath away. "Thank you," she whispered again. "You don't know what this means." John sat down beside her, trying to calm the storm of questions in his mind. He had just saved an alien, and now somehow he had become a part of her story, a story he couldn't even begin to understand. The air in the apartment grew heavier with every passing second. John stood next to Cirrus, his mind racing. The soldiers hadn't moved, their cold eyes never leaving the alien princess. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had agreed to marry her, but the reality of the situation was hitting him now. He wasn't sure what this alliance meant for either of them, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't follow through, everything would fall apart. Cirrus was still standing tall, her posture straight and unwavering, though he could see the tension in her jaw. She was ready for this, but John wasn't sure he was. He didn't know how to handle alien soldiers or how to be a part of a royal alliance. It felt like he had stepped into a world that wasn't his own, a world full of rules and dangers he couldn't possibly understand. The soldier who had spoken earlier, the one who seemed to lead the group, stepped closer to them. "We're not going to wait forever," he warned, his voice cold. Either you come with us, princess, or we'll take you by force." John looked at Cirrus, her expression unreadable. She met his gaze with a mixture of determination and a hint of something softer, something like trust. "I can't let them take me back," she whispered to him, her voice barely audible. "You're my only chance." John clenched his fists. He had no idea what he was doing, but he couldn't just let them drag her away. "All right," he said, looking at the soldiers with defiance in his eyes. "We're not going anywhere with you. If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The soldiers didn't seem impressed. The leader gave a cold laugh. A human standing in the way of the Empire. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're dealing with." John's legs were shaking, but he stood his ground. He didn't care if they were aliens. He didn't care if they were soldiers with power beyond anything he could imagine. He wasn't going to let them take her. He couldn't. Cirrus placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch calming, but her voice was firm. "You don't have to fight them. You've already made your choice," she said softly. "We have to leave. Now." John looked at her, his thoughts racing. He didn't know how he had gotten here. Just days ago, he was living a normal life, focused on his job and his own plans. Now he was in the middle of a galactic conflict, with an alien princess in his apartment and soldiers threatening to tear his life apart. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the only choice he had was to follow through. "I'll marry you," he said again, more firmly this time. "We'll do this. We'll make this work." Cirrus's eyes softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means." But before they could take a moment to breathe, the leader of the soldiers gave a sharp signal. "Prepare to leave," he ordered. "We're taking her whether she likes it or not." Cirrus turned to face John, her eyes burning with intensity. "We don't have much time. We have to leave now." John nodded, though uncertainty still clouded his thoughts. What had he just agreed to? Was this really the right decision? But there was no turning back now. With Cirrus by his side, he was about to face a world he never imagined. The next morning came quickly. John awoke to the sound of quiet footsteps in the hallway, the faint light creeping in from the cracks in the windows. It felt like a dream, everything that had happened. The alien princess, the marriage, the soldiers who had been after them. It was hard to believe it was all real. But as he sat up in the small room, he knew it was all true. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Cirrus was standing by the window, looking out at the empty street below. She seemed lost in thought, her back straight and proud, though there was something vulnerable in the way she held herself. John didn't want to interrupt, but he couldn't stay silent either. He had to know what was next, what they were supposed to do now. He stood up slowly and approached her. "Hey," he said softly. "How are you doing?" Cirrus turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a soft smile. "I'm okay," she replied, though John could see the uncertainty still lingering in her gaze. "It's just so much to take in. I never thought it would end up like this." John nodded, understanding more than she knew. "Neither did I," he said. "But here we are." She walked over to him, her eyes softening as she reached out to touch his arm. "I've been running my whole life, John," she said quietly. "Always hiding, always fighting. But when you saved me, when you stood by me, I realized something. I don't have to keep running anymore." John was taken aback by her words. He had always seen Cirrus as a strong, determined woman. But now, hearing her say that, he realized just how much pain and fear she had been carrying on her own. "You don't have to," he said, his voice steady. "We're in this together. Cirrus, you don't have to do it alone anymore." Cirrus looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to see if he really meant it. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "I believe you," she whispered. "And for the first time in my life, I feel like maybe I can have a chance at something more than survival." John smiled, feeling the warmth spread through him at her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things might actually be okay. He had promised to protect her, to stand by her, and now he understood what it meant. It wasn't just about fighting to stay alive. It was about building a future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The door to the small room creaked open, and a soldier stepped inside. John stiffened, but the soldier only nodded at them. "The safe house is secure," he said in a low voice. "We can move out soon." Cirrus turned to John, her eyes flashing with something fierce. "It's time," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We're not running anymore." John's heart beat faster as he looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. They had both been through so much, but now they were ready to face whatever came next, together. They walked toward the door, not as fugitives or strangers, but as partners. The world outside was still dangerous, still uncertain, but with Cirrus by his side, John knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, they would face it head-on, together. The next few days felt like a blur. John tried his best to carry on with his normal life, but everything had changed since Cirrus entered his world. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to show up at his door. But nothing happened, and for the first time, he felt strangely protective of the alien woman who had become an unexpected guest in his life. Cirrus stayed inside, not venturing out much. She spent most of her time near the window, gazing out at the city below, her eyes distant, as though she was waiting for something. John couldn't help but notice that she seemed restless, like a caged animal. He tried to offer comfort, but Cirrus kept to herself, her quiet strength both reassuring and unsettling. Then, one evening, everything changed. John had just returned home from work when he found Cirrus standing in the middle of the living room, her expression tense. She was staring at the door, as though she could hear something he couldn't. Her hands were clenched into fists, her whole body tense with fear. "What's wrong?" John asked, walking over to her. Her eyes met his, wide with panic. "They found me," she whispered. "They're coming." John's heart skipped a beat. He had been prepared for something, but not this. "Who's coming?" he demanded. "Who are they?" Cirrus didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be listening to something far beyond the walls of the apartment, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. Then, with a sudden movement, she grabbed John's arm and pulled him toward the back of the apartment, out of sight of the front door. "Get ready," she said, her voice steady but full of urgency. "You need to leave, now." "Leave?" John repeated, still not understanding. "Why?" "I'm not going anywhere." Cirrus turned to him, her face a mixture of fear and something else, something hard to place. "If you don't leave, you'll be in danger too. I can't protect you if they get here first." John stared at her, his heart racing. He had thought helping her would be as simple as taking her in and offering some shelter. But now it felt like everything was about to fall apart. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the door, slow and deliberate. John could hear muffled voices, but he couldn't make out the words. Cirrus looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "You need to trust me," she said, her voice low. "They're coming for me, but they won't stop with me. They'll take you too, if they get in here." Before she could finish, the door burst open. John jumped back in shock as several tall figures stepped into the apartment. They were dressed in black armor, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. Their presence was overwhelming, and John could feel the pressure in the air. The alien soldiers stood still for a moment, scanning the room, their eyes locking onto Cirrus. "Princess," one of them said, his voice cold and commanding. "You are coming with us. Now." John felt his chest tighten. The fear in Cirrus's eyes was now replaced with something else, a fire, a spark of defiance. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The safe house was quiet, the kind of place where the world outside felt far away. John sat at the small wooden table, his mind still racing. It had been hours since they arrived, and though the silence was welcome, the uncertainty in his chest only grew. He had promised to marry Cirrus, to protect her, but the weight of the promise was heavier than he had expected. Cirrus had disappeared into one of the rooms when they arrived, leaving John alone with his thoughts. He kept replaying everything in his mind. How they had gotten here, how they had gone from strangers to partners in a matter of days. The decisions he'd made seemed so much bigger now, more important than he could have ever imagined. The door creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. Cirrus stepped into the room, her face softer now, but still filled with determination. She wasn't wearing the royal garments he had first seen her in, but instead a simple outfit that made her look more like any other person. For a moment, she didn't look like a princess, just a woman who had found herself in a desperate situation. She walked over to the table, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. "John," she said, her voice calm, "I need to ask you something." John looked up at her, his heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" he asked, feeling the tension in the air. Cirrus hesitated for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table. "I know we agreed on this marriage, and I know you're doing it for me, but I need to know if you're truly willing to commit to this, to me." John felt a surge of emotions. He had agreed to marry her because it was the only way to protect both of them. But now, hearing her ask that question, he realized how much more it meant. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something real. "I didn't ask for any of this," John said quietly, his voice sincere. "But I promised you I'd help you. And I'll keep that promise. I don't know what's ahead, but I'm in this with you. For whatever it's worth." Cirrus studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, as if she had come to a decision. "You've been more than just my protector," she said softly. "You've been my ally, and I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in my life." John's heart tightened at her words. He had never expected to be in a position like this, never imagined that he would play such an important role in her life. He wasn't a hero, but he was doing the best he could. For her. For them. "I don't know how to be a prince or a king or anything like that," John said, his voice a little shakier than he wanted it to be. "But I'm not backing out. I'm with you. I don't care if it's a marriage of convenience or something else. I'll stand by you." Cirrus reached out and took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think I could trust anyone like this. But you're different. And I need you. More than you know." John squeezed her hand back, his determination growing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they had to face, he knew they could handle it together. They were no longer just two people caught in a war they didn't understand. They were partners, allies, and maybe, just maybe, they could find something more than survival in this strange, dangerous world they now found themselves in.